Hello and welcome to In Conservation, the podcast of the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. I'm Sophie Baker, editor of our members magazine Local Wildlife and host of the podcast. Today, I'm going on an adventure around the wonderfully named and wonderfully scrubby Strawberry Hill, our rewilded farm in Bedfordshire. My intrepid guide will be Chantelle Warriner, who spent the last 2 years getting to know this amazing place, and she'll be guiding us through the sights and sounds and inviting us to explore this tangle of blackthorn and hawthorn, a wildlife wonderland in the heart of an intensively farmed and nature-depleted Bedfordshire landscape. It's an absolute riot of noise in spring, with over 200 warbler territories and 30 singing nightingales recorded in 2023, plus turtle doves and countless other species singing their hearts out. But we were there in September, at the tail end of a typically, these days, unpredictable and changeable summer, and with autumn well and truly on its way. Let's see what we discovered. Yeah, so we're here at Strawberry Hill. I've only been here very briefly once before in my role, so I'm really excited to walk around and see what we're going to see. And we're here in autumn, so it's not peak species season, is it, in terms of the kind of...
No, we're sort of in a bit of a transition at the moment, so lots of our summer visitors are getting ready to fly back to their overwintering grounds.
I mean, how would you describe Strawberry Hill to somebody who doesn't know anything about it?
So Strawberry Hill is essentially a rewilded farmland. So back in 1988, the farmer decided to take the entire farm out of arable production and left it as set aside, essentially. So all cultivation stopped in 1988, and the site was essentially allowed to develop into this tussocky grassland that you can see around us now.
Yes, yeah, and we're standing on a sort of very tussocky, knobbly path, which is quite dangerous for the ankles.
Yeah, quite typical of Strawberry Hill. So if you do ever come along for a walk, then wear your sturdy boots.
And we're surrounded by a sort of shoulder height, I would say, at its highest, very sort of rough grassland.
Yes, yeah, and that's exactly how we would describe this. So this rough grassland is one of the largest areas of grassland that we have on site. So the majority of Strawberry Hill is covered in dense scrub. It's made out of blackthorn, hawthorn, willow, that kind of thing. But these grassland areas that surround the farmhouse and the farm buildings, we believe the farmer kept open predominantly for his barn owls, which he was very fond of. So Hugh White was the farmer who managed the farm and owned the farm back in the 80s, and he owned the farm right up until he passed away fairly recently. And he really fell in love with the barn owls that flourished in those early stages of succession, essentially after the farm was taken out of production. And actually 100 barn owl chicks were born on site in that first 10 years after it was taken out of production.
That's amazing.
Which, yeah, is incredible really to think that in such a short space of time you had that influx of wildlife, and that just demonstrates that along with the grassland that developed, you had plenty of things like small mammals, so field voles, shrews, and wood mice, that kind of thing that would sustain these barn owls. And then alongside that you get everything else that pops up, so
like it all rushed back in.
Yes,
basically, didn't it? And that's the thing, is that it doesn't often take that much, does it?
No, quite often you can just leave an area and leave it to its own devices and see what happens, see what comes in, see what grows.
And this has been really quite a big, long experiment of that sort, hasn't it? I mean, there's been very, like you say, I think, so I guess these bits were kept clear, but the rest of it, I mean, really just was left to its own devices. Is that right? And
yeah, it's interesting walking around the site because you'll come into areas that look like they must have been grazed or cut, because there are some areas of open grassland, particularly along the stream edge. So there's a potential that something went on in those areas, but we're still trying to figure that out because we don't know exactly how the land was treated over the past 35 years, but predominantly it was left to its own devices. And it just demonstrates really how quickly wildlife can take back control.
Yeah.
And really thrive in the absence of agriculture and human intervention. So my name is Chantelle Warriner, and I'm a reserves officer with the Bedfordshire Wildlife Trust. And I have looked after Strawberry Hill for the past 2.5 years, getting on now. So since we took the site on back in 2022, and it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, I can
So,
imagine. And how big is the site?
So the site is around 150 hectares, which is roughly 375 acres. So really large, particularly for Bedfordshire. So Bedfordshire is a relatively small county with a very minimal landmass that's actually protected for wildlife. I think it's only around 1.2%
Wow.
is protected under the SSSI designation. So within Bedfordshire, this really is a treasure trove for wildlife. And to have an area that's so vast and uninterrupted is really quite rare. So the site is crisscrossed by bridleways and public rights of way, but that really is the only disturbance that this site endures as such at the moment. So yeah, it'll be an interesting challenge for us going forward to navigate access requirements and levels of disturbance, and that's something that we're thinking really carefully about before we come in and make changes to the site.
Yeah. So there's something landed on me, I think. Oh, there's a spider. Oh, fantastic. Well, I have to say, it's a harvestman, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Harvestman spider. And I have to say, one of the things, we haven't walked very far yet on Strawberry Hill, but even just walking through this kind of very damp grassland, on this kind of path through the rough grassland, I've seen so many insects.
Yes. You can hear them as well around you, can't you? Yeah.
Yes, you can. And so many crane flies, harvestman spiders, flies, even at this time of year, even on the kind of dank weather that we've been having the past few days.
But it's interesting that you mentioned the insects, because we just recently had a report come in from an entomologist named Graham Lyons, who he's renowned in his field, really well respected entomologist. He has been studying well-known places like Knepp and Ken Hill over in Norfolk, so rewilded sites that have been rewilded on a large scale. And he offered his services to us to come and do some entomological surveys, so essentially monitoring the insects through the summer last year. And in one summer he recorded 693 different species of insect, including 30 that have some kind of protection or designation. So
wow.
Rare species that don't occur in many other places.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And it's important because this place isn't a SSSI or a site of a site of special scientific
interest. That's the one.
Bit of a tongue twister. Yeah, SSSI or even, does it have any kind of designation?
No, so at the moment there's no designation on the land, although the species assemblages that we're finding, I mean, the birds alone would, you'd be able to have the site designated as a SSSI just with that alone. So, but at the moment, because we would like to come in and decide for ourselves the best way to manage the land, and we're in a good place to do that. We've got good staff and good expertise to be able to make good choices for the land, and actually not having the designation will help us in that sense. We are working closely with Natural England. They support what we're doing here, so down the line designation might be something that we explore, but at the moment it works for us to just have that control over what we do at the site. But we know it's a really special place. And
absolutely, and that's why we've been working so hard to own it. I mean, and there's been an appeal going on, which, you know, is our biggest ever land purchase appeal, which has just had an incredible response from people. Yeah, it really has. It's really heartwarming, really, to see the response that it has had, and not just locally, nationally. We've had people donate from all over the country, but equally all over the world. So we've had donations come in from as far-flung places as New Zealand. So this really is, it's touching the hearts of lots of different people, and I think it just demonstrates how
people are starting to realise the importance of these sites, and that we are such a nature depleted country as a whole. And there's value in these sites, and people want to see them protected, and to help in that endeavour. And we always say, whether you've got a few pounds to spare or a lot more than that, it's all valuable, and it all goes to the same place and helps us to support these local projects.
Big local project.
Yes.
I mean, and it is a really big site, and we've literally walked about I don't know, 50 meters in, so let's keep going. And I can hear crickets and grasshoppers and things.
There's lots of life all over the site. So I'm just about to take you down the conservation path, which is very aptly named because we're finding that along this path we've got many of our rarer species cropping up. So things like the nightingale, turtle dove, but also really strong populations of pyramidal orchids and interesting plant species that we don't have elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that although I haven't visited here, obviously it's such an exciting project across the whole trust that staff across the whole organisation are very invested and excited about the project. And the word that I keep hearing from people is abundance.
Yes, yeah, and there really is an abundance of life here. I think one of the key things about this site is, yes, we do have those rare species on site, like the nightingale, which has got lots of publicity within our appeal and our publicising to our members. But actually, it's those common species like the speckled wood butterfly and great tits and long-tailed tits and our chaffinches, that they're here in such abundant numbers that you don't see elsewhere. So I have a particular interest in butterflies. I studied them during my master's degree, so I've always had a soft spot for butterflies. And there are so few places where you can go for a walk and have those clouds of butterflies disturbed as you walk through a meadow or as you walk along a ride. And that's something that I've experienced here. So although you might get things like gatekeepers and speckled woods and meadow browns, they're relatively common across the landscape, but here you get hundreds of them, and you get hundreds of them all in one place, and that's a really rare thing, and it demonstrates just how rich the nectar sources on site are. And if you're getting things right at that bottom layer with your plants and your invertebrates, then that's how these big populations of birds are also thriving. So it's why we've got up to 50 breeding pairs of willow warblers, for instance. And that's replicated across so many different species. It's not, it's all of them.
And it's the shifting baseline syndrome, isn't it? You know, it's like for us, you know, of when roughly we were born, you know, that idea of clouds of butterflies is a kind of wondrous, exciting sort of moment. But actually that would have been so common not that long ago. Like most people just would have experienced that just walking along the lane somewhere, you know, and it just doesn't happen anymore, does it? And no. So it must feel just so exciting to sort of see the potential of that, you know, that is still possible in this day and age with just a little bit of care, a little bit of lack of attention.
Yes, definitely. And that's something that our CEO's pointed out a few times, is that it takes him back to his childhood, and it reminds him of the typical British countryside that he explored as a child, and the countryside that ignited his interest in wildlife and the natural world. So leading on from that, I think this is a place that we can bring people, we can bring children and local interest groups, or people that have never really experienced nature before, to bring people from the towns and the cities and bring them here just to ignite that enthusiasm and that passion in wildlife. And that's a really key part of our plans going forward, is to work out a way that we can protect these habitats and ensure that they're safeguarded, but also allow people to come in and experience it and to learn about nature. And that's the only way that we're going to protect these kind of landscapes long term, is to allow those people to come in and to learn about what's on their doorstep and why it's so important to protect these places.
And not just protect the ones that are existing, but also create new ones.
Yes, exactly.
Like this one was in 1988, you know, by that amazing farmer with such foresight,
Yes.
in a way.
Yeah,
you know.
progressive. He was so progressive, really, for his time. Yeah.
If someone did that now,
Yes,
in 35 years, we'd have another one of these,
yes,
you know. And
exactly.
so bringing
Yeah.
people to somewhere like this, I can only imagine how inspirational that might be.
Yeah.
To kind of enable that to
Yeah.
bring nature back, because, you know, looking after reserves is so vitally important. Those pockets of species that can then repopulate the landscape, but they can only repopulate what we leave for them to repopulate.
Yes,
so we need more.
Yeah, and it's not just about these big vast areas. I mean, you don't have to have hundreds of acres of land to make a difference, and actually creating corridors along back gardens and along hedgerows is just as important to that repopulation of the land as having these areas where you do have a big area, a big chunk of land set aside. And that will be key in our plan going forward, is to work with the local farmers and landowners and local communities to try and connect our site with the surrounding landscape, and to allow things to come into Strawberry Hill, but also to move out and to repopulate the land. So yeah, if you've just got a back garden, then that's the best place to start, and that's just as valuable as what we're doing here. So,
yeah, really important. I just want to address, just in case it does come across, I'm going to ask the question. We can hear, is that shooting that's going on in the background?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably good to clarify, in case that's coming through on the podcast, that there's nobody shooting on Strawberry Hill.
No,
here.
there isn't. No, so the noise that you can hear, the popping sound, is the local sporting targets. So it's based in Risley, and it's a clay pigeon shooting range. So yeah, it's generally a bit of a constant drone that we have on site, but you do get used to it, and the wildlife doesn't seem overly phased.
No, I just thought it was best to address it in case it comes through on the podcast and people are thinking, what are you shooting?
Yeah.
We're not.
No.
And we stopped in a scrubby patch, which I imagine in some ways is typical of the site, but there is a path through this bit, so it's a bit more accessible.
So when we first took the site on, if I just walk you along here, this pathway was actually scrubbed up to within a shoulder width.
Wow.
So if you can imagine, now it's about 3 or 4 meters wide. So you really had to push your way through to get through here. But we decided that we wanted to open the pathway up to enable us to monitor the site, but also because we could see that beneath the scrub, the grassland was really trying to push through, and there were still some valuable nectar sources. So things like knapweed, common century, fleabane, these really rich nectar sources that they were just being smothered out by the scrub. So much of our work focuses on creating this mosaic of habitat. So what's essentially happened at Strawberry Hill is you've got this really dense scrub that's formed, leaving only a few patches of grassland. So one of our aims coming in is to kind of decide, right, would it be more valuable now at this stage in its succession to start creating some open space, to start creating a bit more of a mosaic? So creating more different types of habitat, essentially, and the more different types of habitat you have, in theory, that encourages a greater diversity of species to come in. So we thought that it would be worthwhile and valuable to open up some of the grassland through here, and to essentially just to see what comes up and what pushes up through the sward. And I was really excited this year to walk along here in early summer, back in May, June time, and I noticed a few pyramid of orchid stalks coming up through the soil.
Wow, so exciting.
So something that I hadn't seen the year previous. So I noted a few of these. They looked a bit straggly. They looked like they needed a bit of energy, essentially. But then I came back about a month later, and there were maybe 30 or 40 pyramidal orchids, all in their splendour, looking really vibrant and healthy. So I like to think that was because we allowed that light down to the base layer, which is essentially what we're doing when we do glade creation and glade clearances. We're allowing that sunlight to penetrate down to the ground, which gives different flowering plants that opportunity to push up through, and created a really wonderful nectar-rich pathway through the scrub. and we found that it attracted things like butterflies and dragonflies. And it also, interestingly, we popped up a wildlife camera. So these are cameras that are triggered at night or during the day by any wildlife that goes past. And in one of the glades that I created just up here, we found a woodcock was using it at night time.
Wow.
Which was really exciting. So woodcock is an interesting species. They generally are only seen early evening and into the night when they're active. So they'll bed down in the scrub during the day and hide themselves away. But then at night, they come out and they forage in these open areas. So it kind of demonstrated that these open areas were valuable to at least that one particular species. And obviously, if they're valuable to one, they're valuable to many others. And so particularly the male woodcocks will use the open areas as a place to go and display to females. So that was a really exciting find, and it was noted when the local bird club were actually doing a woodcock survey, because their numbers have been declining in recent years. So it was really great to get hard evidence that we've got them on site. And we found them in 2 of the new glades that I created at opposite ends of the site. So it just shows that these birds are spread throughout, and they're making use of these new areas almost immediately as soon as they've been made.
Oh, it's so exciting, isn't it? It must be so rewarding working on a site like this and doing something like that, being the one that's decided to do that and have a little experiment, see what happens, and then just to actually so immediately see that outcome,
see a difference. And that's the beauty of the site, is that it's so vast and it's so large that we can do these little experiments and we can clear some of these small areas and just see what happens without causing any damage to the ecosystem as a whole. And really it's a really important part of our pre-management strategy, is to come in and to see what we have on site before we make any big decisions about whether or not we need to do some scrub clearance to help that succession start again from scratch, or whether we need to create more glades and more grassland areas.
And you're not doing this alone. I mean, there's a lot of local recorders and volunteers, and I feel like there's been a lot of interest and a lot of love for this site.
I mean, we came across this site because of local interest. It was local interest groups that really pointed us in its direction when it came up for sale and said that we really had to save it. And we would be nothing without our local interest groups, really. They're people with such expertise that's developed across decades, and they're people that have expertise in very specific fields. So we have a lichenologist that comes onto site to study the lichens. We have some incredible botanists within our county that give up their time to come and find out what's here and help us to inform that future management, and help us to demonstrate just how special this place is. Volunteers are really the backbone of the Wildlife Trust, and we couldn't do half of what we do without our volunteers.
No, and we're very grateful. Here's a little aside, just for you. One reason our 3 counties are a special place for wildlife. BCN Beauties.
Hello, my name's Brian Eversham. I'm Chief Exec of the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cambs and Northants, and for the last 7 years I spent a lot of my spare time looking at elm trees. Dutch elm disease is what most people know about elms, and they think it killed them all. And it certainly removed a lot of the biggest trees in the landscape and changed the way our countryside looks. But there's evidence that the regrowth of those elms now means we've got more elms than we had before the disease. And in our part of the world, there are certainly quite a lot of big trees that survived right the way through, with some evidence they've got genuine immunity to Dutch elm disease. I got involved because of a book that came out in 2018 which said there were 62 different sorts of elms in Britain, when previous books had said 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe 7 species. Quite a lot of the new ones were described for our own Wildlife Trust reserves, so I went to find those, and 7 years later I'm pretty convinced that 62 might be an underestimate, that Cambridgeshire is probably the most elm-rich place, certainly in Britain, possibly in Europe, and I've got the beginnings of genetic evidence and of wildlife evidence, looking at insects feeding on elms, that they are real species. The insects can tell the difference, so the botanists ought to tell the difference. And we know that they're really important for special wildlife. So white spotted pinion moth, wrinkled peach fungus, what a wonderful name, is an elm specialist, only survives by growing on elm trees, and this part of the world is the centre of the range for those rare species as well. So we should get out there and look at our elms more closely.
As we're walking along here, I have to say I'm very much a layperson, but I have seen some signs of mammal life here as well. I think I've seen some badger poo, maybe some hedgehog poo, although I'm a bit more sketchy about that.
There's definitely, there are some local foxes that like to deposit right in the middle of all the pathways.
Okay, that's probably what it was.
So
then.
it was
My
probably,
very inexpert eye. Yeah,
it was probably foxes. So this time of year, you'll notice that the scat becomes very slightly red or purple in coloration, and filled with lots of seeds, and that's because the foxes are they're feeding on the berries, so they're not purely carnivorous. They will eat, they're omnivores essentially, so they will eat berries and fruits.
Yeah, you see, I didn't know that. There you go.
In abundance.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I didn't realise that. Sometimes, because I thought if I saw some poo that had loads of seeds in it, it was bound to be a badger if it's sort of a bigger size, but obviously I'm wrong, and happy to be wrong. That's an amazing fact.
Yeah, so we do have badgers on site as well. So we found at least 3 different active sets spread out across the site, and I mean you can see that the scrub is so dense that we've only really explored such a tiny fraction of it, so it's highly likely that there are more. You
couldn't possibly get through it. I mean, when we say it's dense scrub, it's is I mean, it's impenetrable with the blackthorn thorns, hawthorn thorns, bramble thorns. I mean, it's so dense even at foot level that you couldn't push your way through without a machete or something.
No, and that's why the site is so valuable to nightingales. So nightingales, they require this really early successional scrub, which is this mix of things like hawthorn and blackthorn, but also bramble, which comes up through the ground and closes the gaps that are left between the scrub species and creates this really dense thicket, and creates the ideal habitat for them to nest in. So they like to nest really quite close to the ground. They're generally only a metre or so above the ground, and there's only really quite a short window where scrub develops in that way. So typically after, say, 40 or 50 years, scrub will become leggy, it will get taller, and you'll lose that ground layer. But it's not only that natural succession, it's also things like deer populations that will have an impact on how quickly that process happens and how quickly you lose that ground layer within the scrub that the nightingales really rely on. So that's one of the reasons why we're finding nightingale populations are declining across the country. So they're typically restricted anyway to the south and the southeast of the country, with some populations pushing up roughly to the Humber. It's about as far north as they'll go. But we're finding that there's so many different changes in land management. The development is happening. Traditional ways of managing woodland are declining. So things like coppicing, which creates that. Coppicing, if you don't know, is essentially where you cut a tree species or a shrub species down to the ground, and then you allow it to reshoot, and you get that really nice dense growth that comes back. So the occurrence of that kind of management is declining. So that, along with increased deer population, in particular muntjac species, are a known sort of cause of decline within our nightingale populations. That all combined means that they're really struggling to find suitable habitat. So the wonderful thing about this site is that we're kind of at a sweet spot at the moment. So the site is perfect for them. As you look around, you can see you've got the dense scrub layer, but you've also got the dense undergrowth, and you've got the bramble coming through.
And the scrub height, just to give people an idea, I'm not very good at meters, maybe 5 meters high.
Yeah,
on
yeah,
average.
4 or 5 on average. Yep, would agree with that.
So it's not towering above us by any means. There's the odd tree that does, but most of the scrub is about 4 or 5 meters. So you feel sort of enclosed, but definitely not in a woodland.
No, and there are areas on the site. So if you go down to the southern half of the site, you can see that it started to make that transition into secondary woodland. So you've lost the scrub layer at the bottom, and you've got elms and oaks and maples that have begun to dominate over the hawthorn and the blackthorn. So because of that, and because the fact that that southern end of the site is relatively inaccessible for us, we've decided to actually allow that to continue on its journey into secondary woodland.
Because it'll be important for other species as well. It might not be ideal for nightingales, and this is always going to be the problem, isn't it? Is that the different successions are good for different creatures, different moments.
And typically you'll find that these early successional habitats are generally the most biodiverse until you reach a woodland that's maybe 300 or 400 years old. Woodlands take a long time to mature and to reach that biodiversity sweet spot, whereas scrubland reaches it much sooner because it's an early successional habitat that supports a really abundant nectar sources and invertebrates, which then attract in your other species. Whereas woodlands, so ancient woodlands are very biodiverse, but that's because they've had thousands of years essentially, or hundreds of years to mature, and you've got those natural processes that have started to happen. So trees have begun to fall, deadwood has begun to form, which brings in your deadwood beetles and your other insects like that. But with secondary woodland, you'll find that generally it's lots of tall, straight trees with very few features for things like your beetles and your bat species and your bird species to utilise. So whilst we are going to allow some of the site to transition into that woodland and give it the time that it needs to get to that stage, the rest of the site we'd like to come in and manage in a way that we're essentially halting that succession. So come in with grazers to keep areas open and to keep the scrub at a level that's suitable for all of these other species that we have on site.
Yeah, and we've come this far without really giving people any kind of details about the nightingale populations, but it's probably important to mention because they are a bit of a hero of the site. They pique people's interest, and
they are,
really
and
they are quite spectacular to listen to. So how many nightingales have we recorded on site?
So last year we recorded 32 singing males, which would suggest there were 32 territories. We would hope that means they all found a mate and they all found a female to nest with, but that's really tricky to determine. They're very secretive and very difficult to spot. So that'll be a challenge going forward, is to work out whether they're breeding and whether they're breeding successfully. But the fact that we had 32 singing males was really quite special. And along this path in particular, I could be walking along here in May and have 2 or 3 males singing either side of the path.
Wow.
So they're very territorial. They sing their loudest, and the song's most impressive when they're singing to each other.
Yeah.
And fighting for those territories. And this was a really special place that I brought quite a few of my walking groups. So I've had some people come and visit the site, and I've taken them around to explore. And it was a place where people that have had an interest in nature for their whole lives, so decades of experience, coming to places like this, and it made them stop and listen and really take it in, and their faces just lit up, and it was just like watching children in a candy store. It was a really special moment for the people that I brought here, and I think that just coming here and experiencing that, you realise just how special this place is.
Yeah, absolutely. And how much we've lost in the countryside,
yes.
but really that it can come back.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely a message of hope, I think, isn't it? Strawberry Hill.
Yeah, this channel as well was where we had the most turtle dove sightings.
Oh yes, of course.
This year.
So
turtle doves are another species that have declined dramatically in the last 50 years or so, since mostly driven by changes in agriculture, a loss of that edge habitat that typically you used to get around farmland. So a loss of hedgerows, because they are a farmland bird. They go out into the farmland and feed on various seeds, but then they come back into the scrub for protection and to breed. So they need that edge habitat, and they need that transition between the two types of to farmland and scrubland, essentially, which is what we do have here. But we're still learning about where our total reserves are, which habitats they favour, how much they're going in and out of the site. So again, that's another thing that is being done by our volunteers. So we have some very dedicated bird surveyors that will come out early hours, and we're talking 4 or 5 in the morning to monitor our bird populations for us. So
yeah, have we mentioned how grateful we are to our volunteers?
Yes.
Yeah, so I've just stopped us along this path, which is getting decidedly narrower as we progress through the site.
So it gives you a bit of a feeling of what it was like when we first started.
Yeah, just because we've come across this really ancient, I mean, I'm sure it's not actually ancient, but it looks ancient, sort of gatepost, I suppose. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so this would have been one of the old farm gateposts. There's lots of this kind of old farm paraphernalia around the site, and in my days exploring and just going a little bit off-piste and wandering around the site, I found things like this, and then also lots of water troughs, which would suggest that there were grazing animals here at one point, possibly before the 1960s, when it would have been more of a mixed-use farm. But things like these gateposts in themselves are amazing little havens for wildlife. So this one is covered in different types of lichen. I'm not particularly good with my lichens, I'm afraid, but we've got these beautiful fluted shapes that you can see just coming out of the woodwork. So yeah, these are features that in themselves are valuable.
Yeah, I love lichen forests. It's like if you can imagine yourself down there at that scale, and just them towering over your head. And gateposts are a great place to look for them. But yeah, I just find these sorts of things so evocative of kind of, I don't know.
It's a gateway into the past, isn't it? You can imagine that this was where machinery would have tracked up and down through the land.
Yeah, which is just very hard to imagine how it looks at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it is amazing how much has grown. It's so cool. You feel like you're kind of like going into the wilds, now. This really feels, and it's still a pathway. I mean, it's definitely not dense scrub that we're fighting our way through here, but it's closing in around us and getting a bit darker.
And that's a really exciting thing about this place, is it feels like somewhere that you could make discoveries and new discoveries, and you could stumble across something that nobody's ever found or seen before.
Yeah.
And we are finding that there are rare and scarce species here. So recently, I mentioned Graham Lyons. He found a spider which hasn't been recorded in Bedfordshire. So it's the first time that this particular spider has been recorded in Bedfordshire.
Wow.
And it was found in really, really good numbers on site, across the whole site. So from the minute up to who knows what size.
And I've heard tell that there are quite a lot of interesting bats that use the site, certainly.
So bats is a really interesting one, because we're finding that we've got a range of different species that are associated with a number of different habitats, that are all using this site, and we're trying to now work out whether they're using it to commute through, so as a place to transition from one habitat to another, or they're staying here and they're feeding. So that will be an interesting project going forward. But one species in particular, which is typically a woodland specialist bat, so it's called the barbastelle, and the barbastelle is relatively rare now, and has suffered from things like woodland clearance and habitat loss. And we're finding through our monitoring, so using static monitoring equipment that can listen for bats as they pass through the night over the equipment, we're finding that they're using Strawberry Hill as a transitional point between this ridge of woodland which runs from the northeast down to the southwest. So we have woodlands such as Swine's Head up in the northeast, which runs into a woodland called Pennamorleys, and then we gradually transition into Strawberry Hill. And then as we come out of the site down to the southwest, we head into a woodland called Westwood, which then, if you look on the maps, that ridge of woodland continues on in the same kind of direction between two fairly urbanised and nature-depleted areas. So yeah, Strawberry Hill we're finding is a really important stepping stone for species like that. So not necessarily species that are staying here for any length of time, but it's a really important, safe rite of passage, essentially, that these animals can use to get between woodlands and to expand their ranges.
Yeah, because when you look on a map, those woodlands look like little sort of islands, don't they?
Yes.
So, and between those islands is, as you'd imagine, in the countryside, it'll be either open fields,
Yes,
maybe some hedgerows which will help them, but also buildings.
Yes,
and
exactly.
human.
And we don't have to go far outside of the site to see just how vast these fields are. So many of them, they don't have the lush, thick hedgerows that they might have had in decades past, and that's something that we'd really like to work with local landowners to address, and to see whether there's anything that can be done to ensure that farmers are still earning a living, and they're still able to continue with their operations, but in a way that is sensitive to the wildlife that is trying to transition through their land.
Yeah, really vitally important.
So I wanted to point out, while we're in this area, we had a really exciting find earlier in the year, and I've only just been told that I'm allowed to share it with people.
Oh, that's so exciting. It's like an exclusive.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that we have a really dedicated group of bird surveyors that come here on a regular basis through the breeding season to monitor what we have. And we actually found that we had a breeding pair of long-eared owls on site this year.
Wow.
So they spent the summer here, and they successfully reared 2 chicks, and the 2 chicks have fledged. So that's really, really great to hear.
That is absolutely fantastic, and they're one of the owls that you just don't see as much in our countryside.
And that's actually the first recorded instance of successfully breeding long-eared owls in the last 10 years in Bedfordshire. So a really important record.
Wow.
And it'll be great to find out if they come back again next year. And that's really exciting.
So was it near here? Was it near
in this very area. So it was actually during a bat survey, which I helped with about a month ago, that I got to hear them. So they've got this really eerie, almost creaky noise to their call, but the call extends so far that we could actually hear them across the whole site, which was a really exciting experience to know that they were doing so well, and they were moving throughout the site. And
yeah. Oh, that's absolutely amazing. And what sort of habitat do they need to actually have a nest?
This is perfect for them. So they will generally nest in scrub, so in scrub trees, not particularly close to the ground. So they're just known as a scrub nesting species, and they'll use the open areas for feeding. They're a very small bird. In photos, I've always looked at photos of them and thought that they were this really big, tall, grand bird with long ears. But actually, if you look at them relative to other birds, they're actually only about the size of a pigeon, which really shocked me when I read that little tidbit. So
really,
so they're actually
amazing.
Really quite small owls.
Yeah, I would have thought they were kind of, in my imagination, they're at least 2 foot high.
No, yeah, which is what I probably had in my head as well. So really hard to spot.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've got some footage of them calling to each other that our bird surveyors managed to get. So
that
was
just
really
amazing.
Exciting.
Yeah, really exciting. Yeah. And I tell you what, that is so fascinating, because I would not have thought that an owl would nest in scrub. That's not where my imagination takes me. My imagination takes me to a big hole in a tree, a big mature oak or something. That's where my head goes.
Which is the kind of habitat that things like the tawny owl would fit perfectly into, and even barn owls will use holes like that, and our little owls, which are definitely little. We know that those ones are small. Our resident owls use a real range of habitats, both to nest but also to feed as well. So what I find interesting about this site is that in those early days, we probably had more raptors using the site when we had a wider, vast expanse of that rough grassland that we saw earlier on. So things like the short-eared owl hunt over that kind of rough grassland. So they're migrant birds that tend to come over during the winter to feed. But Strawberry Hill has lost its short-eared owl populations because we've lost a lot of that rough tussocky grassland and it's transitioned into this scrub. So I always find it an interesting question to kind of pose, that if we had taken on the site back in the early 2000s, perhaps, when there was still a lot of that rough grassland and we had some of our rarer raptor species like the short-eared owl and the hen harrier coming over and utilising that, would we have tried to keep it open? But then we wouldn't have got the nightingales and the turtle doves. So it's really interesting from a conservation perspective to think about, how we allow the landscape to change and develop and when we step in and manage, essentially. Because there's always something that's winning and something that's potentially losing and that's why it's key to have that mosaic within the landscape so that everything has a chance to win somewhere.
Yeah, because I think, if we imagine if the whole of the British Isles was just given over to nature, we wouldn't have to manage it because it would manage itself. There'd be things that naturally created clearances, and then there'd be natural progression and succession. But obviously that is not going to happen. There's only really, even Strawberry Hill in its vastness is only a pocket in the landscape. So it feels really important that we manage it. Human intervention, even somewhere like Knepp has a huge amount of human intervention.
Oh, definitely.
The term rewilding is many varied and multifaceted, and it doesn't just mean leaving everything to nature.
No, and that's a key thing for me to understand, but also for our volunteers and our members to understand, is that yes, the site has been rewilding for the past 35 years, but we're not necessarily going to allow, or we're definitely not going to allow that to continue across the whole site, because like you say, we would end up with the whole site just being that secondary woodland kind of habitat, which isn't very biodiverse for centuries, really. So a lot of our research in these first few years before we form a finalised management plan will be figuring out how best to manage the landscape so that those rewilded elements are still allowed to thrive, and we take heed of what nature has achieved already and see what we can achieve. But also to come in and manage in different ways. So natural ways of management are favourable at the moment. So we'd love to get cattle on site. So cattle, they essentially mimic the actions of those big herbivores that we used to have roaming the land sort of tens of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say, you used to have roaming the land, by which you mean really a very long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago. But actually a lot of our landscape and a lot of the habitats that we have today, the rich grasslands that we have, they were created by agriculture and people grazing with sheep and small ungulates. And so we have this interesting kind of thought pattern where you have to think that actually a lot of our richest habitats are only about 10,000 years old. It's getting that balance between our ancient habitats and our relatively new ones, which are just as biodiverse and important to preserve as those ancient habitats, like the ancient woodlands.
Which are very important, and a lot of our work goes into preserving those places as well, just to put people's minds at rest. It's about all of these things working together, isn't it? It's not about one being better than the other. And obviously this isn't an open reserve that people can just kind of rock up to yet. It's still a sort of proto reserve, all the the work that we're doing to get towards that, but there are some public paths that people can come along, and some bridle ways.
Absolutely. There's a network of bridleways and public footpaths, so it's worth having a look on a local OS map to work out where it is that you can come and walk, because you can have a really great experience just using those footpaths. And we welcome people coming and sort of having a sensitive look around and then report back if you do spot anything interesting. That's how we discover some of our really interesting finds.
Yeah, and keep an eye on our website for events as well, because we will be running, guided walks and things through the year. And there's also an online guided walk, I think, isn't there? A guide around the site.
Hosted by myself.
Yes.
Yeah, so that will give you a really good insight into the different types of habitat that we have on site, and where you can walk and what you can see. So that's available on YouTube. If you just search for Strawberry Hill Guided Tour, then that should pop up.
Yeah, and check out our website at wildlifebcn.org/events, just in case we've got any coming up. Thank you so much, Chantelle, for showing us around Strawberry Hill and giving our listeners an insight into the site. It's been really amazing just to sort of get a sense of just how wild and exciting this place could be in the future.
Yeah, no, you're very welcome. It's always a really special part of my job to take people around the site and to show them what we have here, and just to watch their reactions really at how special the wildlife and the habitats that we have here are. So yeah, I hope your listeners have enjoyed the experience, and it encourages them to get outside and start making a difference on their own patch.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Thanks again to Chantelle for showing us around this amazing place, and to my colleague Holly Wilkinson for the recording support on this episode. Since recording this episode, and after our largest ever land purchase appeal, we are so excited to have raised the full £1.5 million needed to save Strawberry Hill. The whole of the site is now in our ownership, and we are so grateful to every single person, philanthropist and charitable trust who made a donation of whatever size. If you want to be a part of this inspirational project, you can still contribute to our appeal. Every penny goes towards the development and protection of this special place in Bedfordshire. For more information about that, plus video tours and pictures from the reserve, visit wildlifebcn.org/podcast, where you'll also find links to all the other episodes of In Conservation. If you're not yet a member, please do consider joining. You can find out how to support our work looking after the wildlife and wild places of Beds, Cams and Northants at wildlifebcn.org/join. Every member makes a difference. A huge thank you to James Williams and Jared Wentwick for the podcast music. And finally, do listen out for our next In Conservation podcast, and let us know what you think by getting in touch on social media at Wildlife BCN or dropping us a line from the website. But for now, cheerio!